Thank you for coming. There may be a couple more joining that registered that aren't here yet. I would like it to keep it informal. So to the extent that questions come up, feel free to go ahead and jump in, turn your microphone on and ask a question, or I'll try to keep one eye open on the chat window too, see if anything pops up there. We are in the third part of a three-part series this month on decision making. The first two looked at general decision making and some of the new ways of approaching decision making. I'm now going to turn it and try to look at it of how you actually put some of this into practice, particularly some of the transitions necessary for a more mature organization. So today then, we're going to do a quick review of the traditional top-down authority, but then also look at the advice and consent approaches that are increasingly being advocated by some authors and used by a number of organizations. I'm also going to take a look at how we think about control. One of the challenges we have in the industrial era organization is that they're built more for controlling people doing the work than they are for the actual production of the work. So it's a little bit of a mindset, but at the same time, we cannot eliminate control entirely. So it's a rethinking of how can you control the behaviors and actions you'd want without having unintended consequences. So it kind of is a shift in from what I consider as a hard control approach to a soft control. And this is built up between principles of operation and how you can have tension between some of these principles. Then we're also going to have to take a look at competency to the extent that organizations push decision-making down or across the organization. Many people who have not yet or been greatly involved in decision-making will take upon themselves additional responsibilities, and many of them really aren't prepared. And to some extent, it's not so much the ability as the mental preparedness of what it takes and the fears that's involved. So we're going to take a look then at how you enable that and guide that without having another layer of bureaucracy added to the organization to train people extensively, particularly as you've got a routine turnover in the organization. We're also going to talk about the transition pathway. And this is critical, particularly for more mature organizations. Okay. Turning then to last week's discussion, we were talking about the push, and you see this repeatedly in many McKinsey, Boston Consulting Group, some of the major global authors. You'll see it in Sloan, some extent Harvard Business Review. A lot of the consultants, the management thinking, leadership thinking that is pushing for more delegation of authority, primarily to have quicker, more agile organizations, but they're doing it within the construct of a very traditional top-down delegation of authority. And you can do this. It requires some explicit capabilities, but at the same time, if that authority is retained and only delegated, there's often the fear that it could be withdrawn. And that fear is bidirectional. We talked about that last week. The fear of delegating it to somebody who's going to make a different decision than you might, as well as the fear of accepting that delegation and being second guessed, particularly in hindsight, which often is the case. So again, there's a fear of being withdrawn, which creates somewhat of a hesitation then to actually act upon the authority you may have. We also get into the issue of empowerment. Many people think empowerment is what explicitly is granted to them versus testing the boundaries. Oftentimes, we will narrow the boundaries of what we can do without testing to see what we might be able to do were we try. This is the the thought of better to ask for forgiveness than ask for permission, of testing boundaries, particularly if you do it within the construct of what is beneficial for the organization and not necessarily a personal agenda. We're then going to talk about consensus, well, not really briefly. I mean, a lot of times when we talk about going from team decision making, the issue of everybody making the decision in agreement comes up. This is obviously virtually impossible, particularly if you got any number of people. So the issue there is you can have a lot of discussion, but rarely can you get into a consensus unless it is a minor issue or the consensus is a compromise that you almost get agreement on, but nobody is really committed to because of what the compromise is made. Last week, we then introduced two other concepts. In an alternative to consensus, where everyone agrees, consent is nobody disagrees. You see this in Hamilton and Zanotti, Humanocracy. They advocate this, and a number of the organizations they feature do their decision-making on a consent basis, and there's a process there for consent. Also, you're going to see some in Laloux's Teal organizations. He focused a little bit more on advice, where instead of going through a process of who disagrees and voicing those issues, the advice is you're moving forward with soliciting input from all key stakeholders. Okay. Going into a little bit deeper then, the consent approach then is the decision is not made until everyone has had an opportunity to voice the issues that they see involved. And this involves obviously a somewhat formal process. There's a number of things you could do to make sure that comments are withheld, judgment is withheld, people are given a voice, some formalities, even like the talking stick. Nobody can talk unless they have some physical object. A number of things that are used that way, just to bring out all voices and that nobody is overlooked. And there is some potential of the people with more aggressive personalities, the bullies, could otherwise dominate those discussions. And that's why some of these procedures are put in place to make sure that everybody is heard. And it is a process that keeps going until everybody has been heard, feel that they've been heard. And it's not so much that they feel they're voted down, but they're confident that others have heard their argument and either don't agree to the extent that it's important, or they have modified their thinking. So it's kind of a sense-making process through the discussion itself. And this can be time-consuming. The time involved is not only in the meeting time to make sure that everybody is heard, but there's also some time necessary for team building. You can't jump into one of these quickly without having some understanding of the rules and how people operate together. So there is a little bit of an upfront activities as well as a little bit longer. But the idea here is that there's a trade-off of the team operating more cohesively and over time can get much more efficient, and actually even more important, the decisions being made are being made by the people who have a stake, have more knowledge, so the better decisions are coming out of the process. The advice goes a little bit further in that all decisions can be made by anyone. And I'm pretty leading edge thinking in distributed authority, but this one scares me a little bit. I mean, this is even moving me out of my comfort zone a little bit, in that any decision can be made by anybody if, and this is a big if, they solicit advice from others. And in organizations that do this, they actually have a pretty hard rule, in that if a decision is made without soliciting that advice, that could be one of the few grounds for dismissal. So it's not necessarily a decision being made, the magnitude a range of impact, but did they involve other people? So this requires them to make sure that they seek out everybody who might be a stakeholder, whoever might be affected in any way possible, but also seek out people who have expertise in the issue. So while the impact can be extreme, at the same time, it puts a lot of pressure on the person who's leading this decision to make sure that they involve. So it's not so much a single person making the decision as it is they lead the effort, and they're responsible for convening the team. And based upon everything that they hear, they can then make the decision. They are under no obligation to take that advice, but they have to give that advice serious consideration. I'm not sure we could always define serious consideration, but again, it does put some pressure on the people that are doing this relative to, what fear they have. They may be overlooking a voice. Do they have enough of involvement of people? Do they make sure that they have sought out dissenting viewpoints? So it changes the dynamics of the decision-making process, but it puts a lot of pressure then on the person who's taken the lead, versus the consent process is really a true team effort of equals coming together to make the decision, where someone may be champion the need to address the issue, even champion some ideas. But again, the consent is much more of a team effort, working together, versus the advice is a leader-focused leading a team. Okay. Then there's also the degree of trust. The advice requires a great deal of trust in the people in the organization that they're going to follow the process. And there's also bidirectional trust that the person who's taking that lead can be making some pretty significant. And when you look at Laloux's Reinventing Organizations, he's got one where it was AES, a person in the company actually went to his home country in India, and through this process initiated a new power plant, which is a major multi-million-dollar decision that he basically took the team effort on. Now, this is a huge step, and actually in the AES situation, it's kind of interesting in that when a new CEO came in, that new CEO actually undid some of this advice process. So the advice process is no longer in place because the new CEO did not have the comfort with it. So again, this was a very leading edge, but it was not sustainable through multiple successions. Okay. We then talk about how do you actually transition, and this is a critical component. Last week we talked about the benefits, so I will move past that. If you've missed last week, you're free to watch that video that's on the network. So let's go forward then and look at the question. How do you actually do this without losing control? Because the fear here is anarchy. If you distribute authority and the decision-making that goes with that authority, the initial fear of anyone in a power position and a hierarchy is they don't know what I know. They don't have the ability. They're going to be running in their own directions. And things are just going to go downhill rapidly because it'll be chaos. So there's a general fear of anarchy. So we need to address that in a transition. We also have to take a look at how most authors deal with this. And truthfully, many authors lay out the plan of the end state, the new era organization where the people across the organization have more autonomy. They have the ability to take actions within their area of influence, area of control. They have a lot of ability to use the power of convening organizations. But many of these authors then skip. They'll talk about a number of examples, but when you look at the examples, most of them are either startup organizations where the key group has a new vision of how to run the organization, and they build the culture around that initial vision that they have, not only for what the company will be, but how the company will operate. Okay. Or you're seeing some companies that were in a crisis. It was in a near-death experience, and a visionary leader came in. So, for example, Haier Corporation, Haier Group in China is recognized with their micro enterprises as having extensive distributed decision-making, but that turnaround actually occurred when the new leader was put in place to basically salvage or the company, or basically find out what was there and break it up. So it was a crisis situation, and people understood the crisis situation, and things are a little bit easier to change at that point. But that then leaves us, how do you change an organization while it's mature? It's not in a critical situation. And I liken this to changing the engine on a plane while flying. You have to get many people involved, but at the same time, you have to keep the business operating. Many things are done this way. A lot of change initiatives are done through a skunk works, where the change initiative is protected from the bureaucracy and then merged over time. A lot of change initiatives will also test in small areas and then allow the ideas, the learning to diffuse over time. So there's different ways of doing this. So let's take a look, though, at some of the requirements to actually have this happen. Okay. Within a mature organization, then, and we're talking one that is not in a death spiral, it may be facing challenges, but they're still operating, though the road may be bumpy. Okay. One thing's got to be done is some of the political acceptance within a hierarchy. There's a lot of power centers, many silos. How do you deal with that? And one thought is that you don't necessarily hit it head on. To the extent you try to do a major change head on, you're going to create all kinds of, many times, active resistance. And if you don't see active resistance, you will definitely see passive aggressive resistance, where they may give some head nods, some apparent agreement, but no follow through, or behind the scenes, there'll be some negative actions being taken that try to basically bring down. So they're kind of fighting a guerrilla war in this case. So we have to figure out how you can deal with the power structure, but do it through a side door, in that it becomes a politically acceptable approach. We also then have to look at how much can you do at one time, the degree of disruption. If you're able to pick off small pieces of it, looking at the bigger picture, this is kind of incremental. Again, it's not necessarily looking at just what you can do incrementally, but within the broader picture. This gets back to the small wins concepts. How can you build a series of little things that collectively will get you to where you want to be, where each one is a separate change, can be focused, and actually has some ability then to show some positive benefit by itself. Okay. We're also then taking a look at addressing the hard controls that are in place. The systems of budgets, how that budgeting process is built up each year. The system of authority. When I was working in a large international oil company, we had a very extensive system of authority. Every position I had, when I basically took that position, I signed a document that explicitly granted me how much I could commit the company to, how much I could actually sign off for somebody else, how much I could sign off for agreement to payment of the invoice. And there's even a fourth level within the accounting system of who can sign off on different things. And this was not only dollar magnitude, but also types of expenditures. So this is a very extensive system of authority that was delegated, and I could not get anything that was not within my manager's system of authority. So it was a very top-down delegation through multiple levels. And then the third part was in the traditional performance management system that is tied to the budget. It's tied to the overall goals that are in place relative to the budget and the strategic plan first year. It gets into even pushing down into individual performance, those linkages. Oftentimes it ties into compensation. So there's a lot of really hard controls built into all three of these components. Shifting then, I'm going to be talking more about principles, how you operate from a principle basis and the guidelines that are involved in those principles. But from a principle based, I'm going to approach it from two perspectives. First is, what do those principles enable you to do? And then what do they constrain you from doing? This is a built-in dynamics for some tension then between enablement and constrainment, that you're able to then look at controls for a soft perspective. Instead of the hard controls, I'm looking at the tensions and how you basically built that in a little bit more organically. Okay. Into doing this then, I'm going to be focusing on the principles, and these are the 5 principles that we built into Futocracy. Before I make this transition, let me open for any questions anyone may have at this time. Okay, let me go ahead and jump in and talk about some of the principles. Okay. The first principle is purpose alignment. Okay. A lot of times organizations will focus on what is the purpose, how does the purpose tie to the mission, the vision statement, the values. This is a critical component and oftentimes is treated that way. Unfortunately, too often the purpose is just a short statement that is crafted and used in communication, but it doesn't often go past that in too many situations. So we're talking about here is not the purpose alone, but how the organization aligns to that purpose. And this involves cross-organization alignment, as well as alignment between the organization's purpose and individuals' values and purpose. When people come to work for an organization, there has to be some alignment of what they see as their life mission and how that fits within the organization itself. So there's that component here. The issue of alignment in a hierarchy generally happens within the hierarchy itself, and that disputes in one silo are not handled between the silos. They're handled up the hierarchy where those two silos interconnect on the organization chart. So even though the informal organization may have multiple linkages in the way business is transacted, when it comes to conflict resolution, it is put back into the authority of the organization chart itself. Okay. So the question then is, how do you break away from that approach to alignment into a more free style? And this is where we've been successful in using a customer focus approach. Okay. I liken this, and Reg Butterfield likens this to the Trojan horse concept, okay, in that the Trojan horse represents something on the outside while carrying something different on the inside. So on the outside is a customer focus, and you could bring a group of people together and convene around what does the customer need? How do we serve the customer better? And in doing so, identify the um, the the conflicts within the organization that is limiting one part of the organization from serving. Okay, we did this with a large organization right now. It's a multi-country global organization, had a lot of silos. The customers were complaining, very vocally complaining. So they did a meet the customer approach. A customer who had a lot of complaints came in, and through a facilitated discussion, all the parties basically saw and heard firsthand from that customer. And then they talked through the internal challenges and how the customer saw those internal challenges. Okay. And that became somewhat of a sense-making operation, but just going through that process, the awareness of the issue became much greater. Okay. Now, that then opened the door of the need for purpose alignment across the organization. From that awareness has come an informal purpose alignment team where people from across the organization routinely meet to talk about alignment issues. So this is basically, it's an informal workaround. What had been done before formally when problems came up within the hierarchical touch points is now being done lower in the organization with critical people. They're having the needed conversations. So again, what we set up here then was a backdoor way by focusing on customers to end up with having a cross-organization team designed for the purpose of purpose alignment. Talk about the key issues, where the problems are. Okay. And as part of this, we then were allowed to focus on organizing around work. Okay. The issue of controls came up through the alignment process, but the controls then of, are you controlling the people that do the work? And in doing so, are you building barriers to the production of work? So an overarching principle then came of, what are we doing that is hindering the production of work from the customer delivery point of view? So what you then have is a purpose alignment team that organically developed over time that is given some framework for the production of work, not necessarily the control of work. Now that gives you the background, but you're not yet to distributed authority, which then brings up the autonomy. Okay. Some organizations then will push down explicitly. So for example, sociocracy will have a series of, okay, I'm getting somebody's background here. Sylvia, okay, I just muted you. Okay. So the issue then comes is, how do you push down authority? Many organizations we mentioned earlier will push it down with explicit system of authority. They'll enlarge the system of authority. The sociocracy, holacracy, many other flat organizations will push it down. A flat organization has to push it down by necessity because you've got fewer levels. So there is some ways of doing this. And we've talked earlier then about the consent process, the advice process. If you push that down then, at this point, you have a disconnect. Okay. If you only go through these two components, you can't push down the decision-making without having a connection with the purpose alignment. So there has to be some tension built between these two principles To the extent that you have some autonomy and of decision making, you have to have some limits on that. And the limits on that is built around the purpose alignment. Can the decision be justified relative to the purpose of the organization and how you're aligning with others? The purpose alignment team then has a higher power then of not just looking at the current situation and maybe doing network weaving. This becomes more of a dynamic network weaving process of how do you keep the organization restructured without waiting for disruptive reorganizations? How do people change what they work on? How do priorities change? The purpose alignment team then becomes a clearinghouse for these types of conflicts that may arise. They also then serve as a coach for those that are making the decisions. They are involved in making connections. If someone has a problem, the purpose alignment team has a broader cross-organization perspective. They're able to bring people together to work on common problems. They're able to identify stakeholders. So what you have then is a dynamic interchange between those that are working on purpose alignment and the decision makers that are really across the organization. These two components working in some tension but closely interconnected then requires another two areas. One is transparency. The transparency is required because if you're going to distribute decision making, they have to have the data and the general information, the sense making to make those decisions. That requires some understanding of transparency. Okay. But there's also effectuation. Effectuation is the study of successful entrepreneurs. Okay. When they studied entrepreneurs, they found that those that were successful versus those that were not had operated on a series of different ways of operating. Most organizations work on a causation approach. They will identify goals and then figure out ways of resourcing as necessary, both the monetary, the expertise, the people's time, to be able to put those goals into place. That's a causation approach. Entrepreneurs often don't have that luxury. They're limited on time, they're limited on people, they're limited on expertise, and they're often very limited on financial capabilities. So they do not approach it from a goal perspective. They approach it from a means perspective. Instead of identifying the goals and then resourcing to meet those goals, they identify the means that are available to them and how to use those means to do something aligned with their purpose. So it flips it around. Within organizations, then, most mature industrial era organizations work almost entirely on a causation approach with maybe little pockets here and there of effectuation. The startups will work on effectuation, and as they mature, they bring in more seasoned management and the causation comes into place. The critical component here is in how do you merge causation and effectuation? But the key here is the effectuation because it becomes an enablement of decision-making. Okay. Without effectuation or the mindset associated with it, even though you have the ability, you may not have the framework for making decisions. So let's talk about the framework. The first principle of effectuation is focus on what you can control. Okay. Again, it makes sense. If you cannot control it, you're wasting your time. Okay. So to keep going quickly, you focus on what you can control. Within the decision-making arena, then, you focus on what you can control within the challenges that you are facing and keep moving forward. But at the same time, okay, you do what you can with what you have. This is a critical component of a means-based. To the extent that you identify your means, you move forward with that. But there's another component here, and that's the partnership. You don't limit yourself just to what you have now. You look at partners, and this gets into strategic partnering. Okay. What partnering organizations outside your organization might establish relationships, not only for the current needs, but possible strategic future needs. So, for example, many of the companies, for example, Apple, having conversations with Intel. Okay. A lot of these conversations went back prior to them actually using any Intel chips over time, particularly the graphics types of chips, in that they were developing basically a collective expertise without an actual end result. Now, naturally, it grew into some end results and some great products because of that. But again, the partnerships were built up strategically and then later became tactical. You can do the same thing within an organization. We were talking before we started about communities of practice. To some extent, communities of practice is this type of partnership across the organization. You're building up those relationships prior to actually needing them. But then when the need arises, those relationships are already in place and you could take advantage of them. So again, the key here is you keep moving with what you have, but you also lean on others and not just resource by yourself. Okay. There's also an organizational learning component here, in that the decisions are not seen as knowing there is a best decision. Rarely is there a best decision. Most often, really all the time, there's multiple good decision outcomes or decision choices. Every possible choice so has some issues with it that need to be addressed. You also have the unknown, and that even if you were able to pick the best, there may be things that you don't know that you need to know that you will know later. Okay, these are the challenges then of hindsight. Okay, in hindsight, did you miss something that you should have known? Okay, that's a learning. Or even if you made the best decision, knowing what you knew at that time, at what point do you basically rethink that approach?
Okay, I found this on the web for basically rethink that approach. Check it out.
So the key then is the continuous learning process. We also then get into a number of other related issues of limiting risk to what is and this is a difference in thinking about risk. Oftentimes, risk is done through a management process, identifying probabilities, magnitude of outcomes, and it is done with an expected value. You may try to mitigate, reduce those probabilities, but this is where the low probability high impact can actually catch you. And a very severe outcome can happen because there was a low probability that did happen to hit. In this case, you take the risk to the extent that the worst case is affordable. So it's a scenario analysis. What are the worst possible cases? Can you live with it? If so, then you keep moving. It allows you to move much quicker. The challenge then is the thought process of putting this into place. And if you focus on the principles of effectuation, it gives you guidance then for the decision-making process. Okay. To the extent then that you have the autonomy and the ability, the effectuation then gives you some guidelines as to how to exercise that ability. Okay. At the same time, you've got cross-organization cohesion from the purpose alignment. Okay, so we then have the independence, the autonomy, working in tension with the cohesion of the purpose alignment, but guided by the decision-making process. And within that, there's two higher level principles of transparency and organizing around work. Okay. Questions at this point?
That's a hell of a lot to take in.
I agree. But again, this is basically thinking through what most authors jump over of how do you get there. And we tried to take it apart piece by piece. And this is a 5-year process of thinking how all the pieces fit together. And we're now trying to move forward on putting this together. We've got 2 working groups working right now at different levels of thinking about this. And again, it's a different way of thinking about the organizations. And this is kind of thinking about organizations. When you do the distributed decision making, you don't necessarily have to go immediately to a networked organization, but it starts to lead you in that direction. The networks start to become more important than the hierarchical linkages. A lot of times we focus on the network called the informal organization, but that's not a single network. It's really a network of different networks for different purposes. So you're emphasizing different parts of that network to the extent that the hierarchy itself is also a network that becomes really diminished in need and how often it is being used. So when you start doing purpose alignment, that allows you then to do distributed authority to the extent you've got more autonomy, the networks start to play a larger role itself. Leadership then also starts to change, and that is a distributed concept. We talked a couple months in another approach on the DAC, direction, alignment, commitment. It's a higher level of leadership that was really developed back, I guess about 10, 15 years ago now, but it was developed as a higher order leadership because most leadership models had difficulty with participatory, shared, or rotating leadership models that are increasingly common across organizations, particularly in teams and cross-organization ad hoc problem-solving teams. So when you take a look at leadership as setting direction, gaining cross-organization alignment, and gaining a commitment of the people, that becomes a leadership concept that also allows you to think about leader separate from leadership. And that's a big jump, because oftentimes we talk about leadership being one and the same. The DAC concept of leadership allows some disconnection there. And once you disconnect the leadership from the leader, then other things open up as possibilities. There's also then change to the extent that you're distributing authority down and across the organization. Change then becomes everybody's job. It's not waiting for somebody else and complaining about them not addressing the problem. It's everybody's responsibility to identify problems and convene action toward that. So it's a very different approach than to change itself and how change is impacted, because the decisions then become more of a cross-organization effort that's championed by people who are directly involved. Okay. So this then basically pulls it all together of how to do it, and we'll be doing more discussions on this in the future. At this point, let me open it to any questions that anyone may have.
Can I say something about change?
Go ahead, please do.
It's not really change that we're interested in, is it? It's improvement.
Exactly.
You never want. If you read all the change management literature, it just says change management, but change for what purpose?
Yeah,
it's always for improvement, isn't it? To make things better.
Yeah, exactly. And again, years ago, I moved away from change management because you can manage yourself, you can manage a process, but you really can't manage other people to change. You may get compliance, but you're not going to get commitment. And even change leadership talks about the vision. But again, what you really want is change enablement, because everything's change. When you get down to it,
it is change, but all change is improvement. Otherwise, it's not to be welcomed, is it?
Yeah. Well, why would
so you need to be very explicit. So in orienting the company, the organization to the customer means essentially improving the service or the product for the customer.
Yes, exactly. And again, the reason we went with the customer focus is that it is a non-political, everyone can agree on.
Yeah, I think another thing about the customer is that the organization wouldn't exist without the customer.
Exactly. Yeah,
exactly. It's hardly ever mentioned in.
It's hardly ever mentioned, but it's obvious when you look at it.
Yeah. So you only exist, of course. Yeah. The bigger the organization, the bigger the disconnect between customers and the company.
That's right.
But I like the sort of emphasis on the entrepreneur, because the idea that an entrepreneur has to go to other people to implement their desires, if you like, is pretty obvious. When most of my career has been spent in small business development. So, and most of those businesses have been like 100, 200 employees, but they essentially create a network, but they can't control that network.
Right. Yeah.
So in a sense, tell me if I'm wrong here, but at the heart of your model is an entrepreneur, so that everyone's an entrepreneur.
Yeah. To the extent, because to the extent that you push down authority with distributed decision making, there is an entrepreneurial sense right there, but at the same time, there is a collective interrelationship that cannot be forgotten. In which case, the concept of customer still is maintained, but it enlarges to internal customers.
Yeah. That's the sort of principle of quality management, isn't it?
Right. Yeah. And again, that quality of internal customers oftentimes is overlooked, and it becomes more of a conflict or compliance issue.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of what you talked about, you'll know this, is a lot of what you talked about. It's a perennial problem. What to do with a large organization, how to make them more agile, and so on.
Right.
There's tons of literature on it, but I think the idea of allowing people to be more entrepreneurial, in whatever sense that means, to be entrepreneurial is to have the freedom to make the choices that will.
Right, but it's got to be
improve your own lot, I think.
And it's got to be put into context, though. So how do you build in those soft tensions?
Yeah,
without having to overly control.
Yeah. So if you're an entrepreneur who sets up a business, then you're automatically reliant on component suppliers, for example.
Right.
You're reliant on accountants, specialist accountants. Mm-hmm. You're reliant on investors, and you have to have an informal relationship with all those, but you have to align all those to your goals,
right? Which
are to satisfy the customer. So they do that automatically. They don't all do it very well. They don't all do it explicitly either. So they just say to a supplier, give me component X. They don't say, give me component X because I want to fit it into my
Yeah.
product which I'm going to give to my customer, and they're going to do this with it. That bit is missing.
Yep,
But in
exactly.
organizations, it's probably there
Yep.
in some form, but
Yep.
less flexible.
What's interesting is that organizations over the history have changed. When you take a look at Ford Motor Company, when Henry Ford started, he had basically nothing. Everyone thinks about the assembly line, but at one point, Ford Motor was into the steel and the iron ore manufacturing, and they were actually out getting rubber plantations because there was no supply chain. Once the supply chain this started to break up into pieces, something was lost. It became more of a vendor relationship than a partner relationship. And too oftentimes it still is a vendor relationship, and you're able to lose the ability to actually work together in partnership. So that real approach then enlarges that, and it changes the mindset then also of not worrying about losing knowledge as much as gaining more than you lose.
Yeah.
And this ties back, Peter, to where some of the knowledge management still flows through this process.
Yeah, of course, yeah. Well, you mentioned the learning organization as well, didn't you? So that's
right. Yeah, it fits in. So again, what we've done isn't necessarily new. All the pieces are old. What we're trying to do is we're putting them together in a new way because everybody's working with little pieces. They haven't put them together.
Yeah.
Okay. Comments from others? Okay. Just go ahead and click your microphone, turn on your microphone, and jump in if anyone's got any questions or comments. Andrea, anything? Sylvia, anything?
No, well, the only thing I could say is I like this approach. I'm not a fan of bureaucracy at all because I've worked in it, and it's so very frustrating to get 900 approvals on something that takes like 2 months, and by the time you get the approval, you have to start at square one again because you've lost whatever you were trying to get anyway.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. But again, you've got to build an approach in place. Because you can't do it ad hoc, as necessary.
Right.
Things have to be put in place. And like I said, the authors, they all talk about the end state. Very few of them talk about how to actually transition. And that's a critical component.
Yeah. I think the other element in this is large businesses do need to have control. I think I would term it regulate. They need to be able to regulate the activities of the people they employ. They need to be able to direct those activities. Now, whether you call that control or not is another matter. But
I think I will disagree to a large extent. In some things may need to be controlled because of regulatory and legal issues.
Yeah.
In other cases, though, I think we're making a judgment that people don't have the ability to do it themselves. And when you take a look at case histories, sometimes the ability, particularly with modern technology and a more educated workforce, many have been very surprised at how much can be done.
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah, it's just this control sort of brings images of cogs and machines, doesn't it?
Exactly right. Yeah.
Well, and that's the point of view you're talking about.
Right.
From
I
think.
And again, the problem isn't so much the doing of it. The problem is people's mindset of fear.
Yeah.
And the challenge is how to move past that. And that's why what we're trying to do is build it in little pieces that reduce the fear.
Yeah, remember that many years ago, because we're probably about the same age. There was a video company set up by John Cleese, the Monty Python guy.
Yes. Oh, yes.
He produced something called The Unorganized Manager. I don't know
Yes.
whether you ever see that.
I have seen some of them. Yes, they're
Right. Well,
hilarious.
the Unorganized Manager touches upon what you've been talking about today. And one of the examples and they talk a lot about delegation, preparing the person that you need to delegate to.
Right. Yes.
But at the same time as delegating, they actually talk about risk, but it's a comedy thing, it's John Cleese, it's
right. Yes.
more funny, he's Saint Peter in heaven. he's letting, if the manager becomes organized, they're let into heaven, essentially. Part of the organization is to delegate,
right.
so that you have the freedom to make decisions, which is and he's the unorganized manager is given the opportunity for the subordinate to make their own decisions, but at the same time they need to hang on to some control, and they do that by setting objectives. It's the
right.
managing by results, managing by objectives thing.
Yeah, and the challenge there then is, how can you reduce those numbers of objectives and focus more just on the ultimate, which is purpose?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, which is related to the customer. Yeah,
because again, objectives are pushed down into the organization versus requiring people to figure out for themselves how they link in to delivering purpose.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Questions from others? I hear none, so let me see. I agree, Sylvia. I agree that's a big challenge, and again, it's a big challenge. I think that's why a lot of authors kind of sidestep it. The key is how do you see the big picture and then work in little pieces toward that big picture. I agree with that. Okay. Anything else? If not, we can continue these conversations on the network over time. I'm not sure what the next webinar will be. I need to get some input from others and consider that going forward into June. Thank you for your comments, and would appreciate any other additional comments that you have on how this maybe aligns or conflicts with your current thinking, and what else might be added to moving these ideas forward. With that, I wish you a good day, and see you around the network. Bye-bye.
Thanks for organizing, Ross.
All right. Bye-bye.
See you again.